Imagine living your entire life while staying inside of one room with nothing to look at but a single poster on the wall. That poster would form everything you know while hiding knowledge of the outside world. This is the story posed at the beginning of the game Control. It is a retelling of Plato's famous allegory of the cave, in which captive humans spend their entire lives looking at nothing but shadows on the wall of a cell. The important question posed is this: if the prisoner emerges from the cell and looks at the outside world, how will they know which world is real? It's a question that's been retold through a lot of great stories, from Wizard of Oz to Inception. What is so important about these stories is that they never try to answer the question. They always keep you in a kind of limbo. Was it all just a dream? Does the top stop spinning? The story supports the audience's ability to ask the question. As a discipline, architecture is no different. It often shouldn't give direct answers, but allow us to question what is possible, so we can contemplate space, time, infinity, new ways of living, possible futures, and more. Remember always that the power of architecture is the influence on your current reality formed by a model of the possible. The architecture in Control therefore must support this narrative. That's a tall task, because in order to accomplish it, the game must first construct a digital space that has some relationship to spaces we've already encountered or inhabited. It must create an architecture that feels familiar to many different people, yet unfamiliar enough so that it's not too specific. What this game does to its player is it defamiliarizes a very particular category of architecture. This category is not brutalist, but institutional. But hold up, what's defamiliarization? And how is this game's architecture not brutalist? Everything I've ever read about the architecture of Control says it's about brutalism. These are questions we can answer. But first, you'll have to join me on a little journey of spatial analysis. The architecture in the game references a wide range of modern masters, but in very subtle ways. The game doesn't show an exact copy of buildings by these architects, but it modifies each one in a slightly different way. Let's take a look. Up first, we're going to go to Central Executive, where we see a handrail with the kind of typical detailing that Marcel Breuer would employ. But the hardware is different, and the wood doesn't have a detail at the joints. There is a central and strong pyramid, like IMPE uses, but it's opaque rather than translucent like the one famous in the Louvre. There's bright carpet next to exposed concrete, which Paul Rudolph most famously deployed in the Yale Architecture Building. But you can see this version is slightly more red, and Rudolph's was definitely orange. The boardroom has shades of Gordon Bunshaft's Beinecke Rare Book Library, but the panels themselves don't have a kind of backlighting. Now, the hotline chamber is a really interesting room. It is shaped a lot like the interior of the Cenotaph to Newton by Etienne Louis Boulet, but you are, of course, in the center of this room rather than at the bottom as Boulet intended. This is also similar to a space like Cerebro in X-Men, which likely used that as a reference. Now, the carpeting pattern is a motif commonly used by Frank Lloyd Wright, but it is slightly different in the way that the lines intersect in the center. And the chair is somehow Marcel Breuer's Wassily chair, but it is also Le Corbusier's LC3. Now, in the letter room, we've got the sort of Johnson wax building by Frank Lloyd Wright in the columns and the way that the light comes in, except it's the inverse, that the light and the columns are kind of switched. And then you also have this great reference to Hans Posig's Gross Schauspielhaus, unfortunately lost to time, but there were these kind of light columns in the entrance hall. Now, in the main office, you have the light fixtures from the Met Breuer by Marcel Breuer, which they just did an exact copy of, and I'm totally fine with that because they're beautiful and amazing. Now, the Dead Letters Archive Room is like Marcel Breuer's St. Francis de Sales Church, except, of course, it does not have a pulpit. Now, lastly, there's a large central space in the game, and there's little quotes everywhere, but a couple I'd like to point out is the Firmini Chapel by Le Corbusier, but these windows have a slightly different scale. And if you go all the way up to the top, you'll notice that these shafts are reversal of the Peter Eisenman Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, but they are actually exactly how the National Memorial for Peace and Justice by Mass Design Group will work. Now, there are many more examples. I could legitimately keep going, but I think we've made our point. Now, let's get back to our two big questions. What is defamiliarization? And if this game's architecture is not brutalist, just what is it? Defamiliarization, or ostranania, is the artistic technique of presenting to audiences common things in an unfamiliar or strange way so that they could gain new perspectives and see the world differently. It was popularized by Viktor Shklovsky in a famous piece of writing from 1917 called Art as Device, in which he sought to distinguish the practical from the poetic. Now, this was mostly about language, but it applies to all the arts. It all has to do with legibility. So the architecture in Control is presented in this way, familiar to us because of the slight references described above, yet altered, so that it's imperceptible. Yes, some, not all of these references, do have a type of relationship with or are flavored by brutalism, right? The way the light bounces off the fluted concrete and patterns of striation interlink into poetic form is nothing if not béton brut. And I will be the first to tell you I was absolutely in awe of the visual effects of this architecture. It is truly beautiful. But don't be fooled. Taken together with its organizational strategies and detailed conditions, this architecture is not of a singular style from a certain era. It can't be categorized as brutalism because each of its references come from a huge variety of modern architects, organic architects, postmodern architects, and some who would eschew any type of label. But I can't stress this enough, what those architects label themselves is also not important whatsoever. It's about what we read in the space and its organization. And all the references share an extreme, strong ability to amplify some type of power or hierarchy. These are institutional spaces, art museums, memorials, churches. What is even crazier is that in the game, all of the spaces I've shown you make up one single building called the oldest house, and it is referred to in the game as an object of, yep, power. But these pieces of modern hierarchical architecture aren't organized centrally. The same defamiliarization of the details happen in the organization of the whole project. For comparison, let's look at this detail and how its original modern version is centralized, strong, complete, and its defamiliarized version is dispersed, disjunctive, and in disarray. This is reinforced by the floor plans, maps of the game space. So rather than institutional depictions of authority, the oldest house is a conflation of defamiliarized authorities, all mixed up inside this one crazy building. For me, categorizing the architecture of Control as simply brutalism fails to recognize the game's actual achievement. From Central Executive to the Ashtray Maze, the architecture of the game Control and the oldest house is a masterpiece of institutional defamiliarization. Speaking of the oldest house, it is modeled after a real world building, 33 Thomas Street in New York City, said to be a key location of a massive NSA spying operation named Titan Point. This is a skyscraper in Manhattan, yet the maps in the game are flat and wide, more like a meandering warehouse than vertical organization. Even though you do use an elevator, when transposed, the game space reaches way beyond the envelope of this building. Here is what the outside of the building would look like if all of those flat levels were placed in order inside of the tower. Okay, so there isn't actually a clear distinction of what level you are on in the game. And there's even the possibility that a few of these floors are connected by rail. The graphic here is a speculative one. It shows the stacked level maps in order on the tower as a provocation. It is through this provocation we consider the crossover between digital space and physical space. Imagine walking through New York City and looking at this tower and considering, after watching this video, that hundreds of thousands of people, for hundreds of thousands of hours, have explored and occupied this building as the space you see in this diagram. These tensions and overlaps will become increasingly important as our physical and digital lives merge into one. Is it a coincidence the levels are supposed to be in a skyscraper, yet you play them as flat? Is it simply due to a game mechanic? Or is it yet one more reversal of expectations to keep you guessing? To keep the game once again from having to answer any questions? This subversion of expectations begins to seep into my mind as I play. I wanted to believe all of the spaces were aligned, like the modernists would have had it. And honestly, I thought for a moment I was seeing this wrong. But to my surprise, very few pieces of this architecture actually align as if they were crafted by these masters. As a glaring example, let's look at that call room one more time. Do you notice anything? This box isn't actually centered on the walkway. The side joints don't align with the ceiling joints, which don't align with the floor tile joints. Remember that boardroom earlier? Notice anything? Once again, the wall joints from the panels above don't align with the wood joints below. I can only identify these things as a mistake rather than an inversion. But once again, the game has written itself a foolproof method to elude any resolve for my confusion. Intended or not, these things make the game read a certain way. Now, reading architecture is one of the fundamental skills that architects learn how to do. Reading architecture allows you to distinguish the structure, hierarchies, ideals, and potentials in a given environment based on its spatial organization. This means, yes, the intention of the game design studio is only as good as the final output that I read in the work. Architects have been studying this paradox for a long time. Can people see the concept in your work? You don't get to install a plaque at the front of the building explaining the concept. The building has to speak for itself. Well, so too does a game. And in a game, you get a lot more options to tell the story of a space. You get media, dialogue, character, and most importantly, narrative, which is crucial to our reading of The Oldest House from Control. Well, we've come this far. Maybe I can take a shot at giving you an answer to Plato's question. Remember the main space in Central Executive, designed after the IMP Louvre pyramid? When the Louvre comes down from the ceiling in the same way, notice there is a second pyramid coming up from the ground. This is the moment in the Louvre made famous by Dan Brown in the Da Vinci Code. Well, for the longest time in the game, we look at this upside down pyramid with curiosity, and it holds a sense of mystery. Yet when we finally beat the game, we get a new outfit. Our head is now adorned with a hair comb of a pyramid facing the opposite direction. When we step in and look at the problem now, we see that dual connection between the world we perceive and the world as it is. You see, reality is the synthesized paradox between reason and belief. To quote Slavoj Žižek, to be a subject means radically not to know what foreign object I am. That object is myself. Thank you so much for joining me in the Extra Office. If you enjoyed this video and want more discussions about the architecture video games, I need your help. Please like, share, subscribe, and find me on Patreon or Twitch. There are so many more stories to tell, and with your support, we can make that happen. Thank you.